People are questioning why the McCanns would sedate the twins on May 3rd if there was a stage event happening.
Well, because it's the best of two evils. The handwritten timelines, which Matt said was written over a day or two, were in fact rehearsal sheets of what who needed to do and when. So imagine the twins waking up during those crucial hours of the play. It would ruin the whole plan.
The wind whipped across the barren hilltop as retired military detective Bernt Stellander stood motionless, his weathered face illuminated only by the pale Portuguese moonlight. 7 years of obsessive investigation had led him to this exact spot, the same location where, according to his meticulous surveillance logs, Gerry McCann had returned to in secret during those chaotic days following his daughter's disappearance. Stellander's breath caught in his throat as the pieces finally aligned in his mind. The behavioral patterns, the inconsistent statements, the timing discrepancies, they all converged here, on this unremarkable hill overlooking Praia da Luz. What he realized in that moment would challenge everything the world thought they knew about the most infamous missing child case of the 21st century. "This is where it happened," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible above the coastal breeze. "This is where the truth was buried." If you're new here, hit subscribe. I'm about to take you through one of the most shocking investigations you've never heard about. On May 3rd, 2007, what began as a relaxing family vacation in Portugal's Algarve region transformed into an international mystery that would captivate the world for years to come. 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished from her bed in apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort, while her parents dined with friends at a tapas restaurant approximately 180 feet away. The scene that unfolded that night has been recounted countless times. Kate McCann's horrified discovery of her daughter's empty bed during a routine check at around 10 p.m. The open window and raised shutter, the immediate frantic search throughout the resort. The Portuguese police arriving nearly an hour later, woefully unprepared for what would become one of the most high-profile missing persons cases in history. Within days, the story exploded across global headlines. The McCanns, both medical professionals, found themselves thrust into an unrelenting media spotlight as they pleaded for the safe return of their daughter. The public watched, transfixed, as the investigation unfolded with its bizarre twists and turns, false sightings, questionable forensic evidence, and a rotating cast of potential suspects. But while the world followed the official investigation, few knew that a different kind of inquiry was taking shape in the shadows. Bernt Stellander, a former military detective with over 20 years of experience in behavioral analysis and psychological profiling, had become increasingly troubled by what he was observing in the case. The behavioral indicators didn't align with the narrative, Stellander would later write in his private case notes. "When I analyze human responses to trauma, I look for patterns that either confirm or contradict stated events. What I saw in the McCann case triggered every investigative instinct I'd developed over 2 decades. What began as professional curiosity soon evolved into a 7-year private investigation, one that would consume Stellander's retirement and lead him to conclusions so controversial that many refused to even consider them." Using techniques honed during his military career, Stellander meticulously documented behavioral anomalies, conducted covert surveillance, and reconstructed timelines with forensic precision. His focus increasingly centered on Gerry McCann and a series of actions that Stellander found profoundly suspicious, particularly a secretive return to a specific hill near Praia da Luz that official reports never mentioned. What happened on that hill? What did Stellander discover that the original investigators missed? And why has his explosive investigation remained largely unknown to the public? Where were you when you first heard about Madeleine McCann's disappearance? Tonight, we'll examine the evidence that led Stellander to believe the official abduction narrative was fundamentally flawed. We'll trace his methodical investigation through behavioral analysis, covert surveillance, and psychological profiling, techniques that ultimately exposed what he believes are the horrific actions Gerry McCann took after that fateful night in Portugal. This is not just another rehashing of a famous cold case. This is the story of one detective's relentless pursuit of truth, regardless of where it led him or who it implicated. The official narrative of Madeleine McCann's disappearance remains one of the most scrutinized missing person cases in criminal history. According to police reports, on the evening of May 3, 2007, Kate and Gerry McCann joined 7 friends, later dubbed the Tapas 7, for dinner at a restaurant roughly 180 feet from their vacation apartment in Praia da Luz, Portugal. The adults took turns checking on their sleeping children throughout the evening. At approximately 10 p.m., Kate McCann discovered 3-year-old Madeleine was missing from her bed, while twin siblings Sean and Amélie continued sleeping undisturbed in the same room. What followed was a chaotic investigation plagued by jurisdictional confusion, contaminated evidence, and international media frenzy. Portuguese police initially focused on an abduction theory, with early suspicion falling on Robert Murat, a British-Portuguese property consultant living nearby. However, by September 2007, the investigation took a dramatic turn when Portuguese authorities formally named Kate and Gerry McCann as arguidos, official suspects, a status that wasn't lifted until July 2008, when the case was archived due to insufficient evidence. The official investigation produced conflicting forensic results, including controversial DNA findings from cadaver dogs in the McCann's rental car, obtained 25 days after Madeleine's disappearance, and apartment. These findings were later deemed inconclusive by British forensic experts. Despite multiple reviews, including a 2011 Scotland Yard investigation called Operation Grange that cost British taxpayers over $11 million, Madeleine's fate remains officially unresolved. Enter Bernt Stellander, a name unfamiliar to most following the McCann case, yet a man whose credentials commanded respect in investigative circles. Before his retirement in 2006, Stellander served 23 years in military intelligence, specializing in behavioral analysis and psychological profiling. His work with NATO's Joint Investigation Unit earned him commendations for solving complex cases where traditional evidence was scarce or compromised. Stellander's expertise lay in what he called behavioral forensics, the meticulous analysis of micro-expressions, linguistic patterns, and non-verbal cues that often reveal deception or concealment. During his military career, he developed protocols for interrogation resistance assessment that became standard training for several European Special Forces units. His ability to detect inconsistencies in human behavior made him particularly valuable in cases where suspects had been extensively coached. "In my experience, the body reveals what the mouth conceals," Stellander wrote in his 2005 paper on deception detection. "When someone fabricates a narrative, they focus on controlling their words but often neglect the involuntary signals their body transmits." Stellander's interest in the McCann case began not as an investigation, but as a training exercise. In early 2008, while developing curriculum for a private security firm, he selected the high-profile case to demonstrate behavioral analysis techniques to his students. What began as academic curiosity quickly evolved into professional concern as he identified what he termed clustering anomalies, patterns of behavior inconsistent with the psychological profiles of parents experiencing genuine child abduction trauma. "I've interviewed parents of abducted children across 4 continents," Stellander noted in his case files. "There are universal behavioral markers that transcend cultural differences, specific patterns of grief, anxiety, and hypervigilance. What I observed in the McCann case deviated significantly from these established patterns." The disconnect between the official narrative and the behavioral evidence Stellander observed became the catalyst for his private investigation. While Portuguese and British authorities focused on physical evidence and witness statements, Stellander approached the case through an entirely different lens, one that prioritized behavioral consistency over circumstantial evidence. Unlike conventional investigators who build cases from crime scene outward, Stellander worked from the inside out. He began not with the apartment or the timeline, but with hundreds of hours of video footage showing the McCanns in various situations, press conferences, interviews, and unguarded moments captured by news cameras. He meticulously catalogued micro-expressions, stress responses, and what he called truth-lie differentials, subtle differences in how individuals relate factual versus fabricated information. This unconventional approach led Stellander to focus on aspects of the case that traditional investigators had overlooked or dismissed. While police debated window dimensions and abduction logistics, Stellander was analyzing pupil dilation, voice stress patterns, and contextual language choices that suggested knowledge compartmentalization, a technique commonly used to maintain consistent deception. Perhaps most unusual was Stellander's environmental reconstruction methodology. Rather than simply reviewing crime scene photos, he physically replicated key locations, including building a scale model of apartment 5A to test behavioral plausibility. Could someone perform the actions described in the timeline while exhibiting the emotional states displayed in contemporaneous footage? This approach led him to identify critical inconsistencies between stated actions and behavioral indicators. Criminal investigation typically follows evidence to behavior, Stellander explained in his case notes. My approach reverses this. I follow behavior to evidence. When someone acts inconsistently with their claimed experience, it creates a roadmap to truth that physical evidence often confirms. This methodological reversal would ultimately lead Stellander to the hill outside Praia da Luz, a location that would become central to his explosive theory about what really happened to Madeleine McCann. Bernt Stellander's investigation into the McCann case began with what he called his baseline immersion protocol, a systematic review of all available footage of Kate and Gerry McCann from before the disappearance. Though limited, these pre-incident materials, primarily family videos and photographs, provided crucial reference points for their natural behavioral patterns, unaffected by the stress and scrutiny that would follow. To identify deception, you must first establish truth, Stellander wrote in his case journal. Every individual has behavioral baselines, their natural cadence of speech, default gestures, and emotional expression patterns. Deviation from these baselines under specific questioning contexts is often more revealing than the content of their answers. Stellander employed 3 primary behavioral analysis techniques throughout his investigation. First was his proprietary linguistic pattern analysis, LPA, a methodology that examines word choice, tense usage, and narrative consistency. Second was non-verbal contradiction detection, NVCD, which identifies inconsistencies between verbal statements and accompanying body language. Third was stress response mapping, SRM, which tracks physiological indicators of anxiety when specific topics are discussed. Using these techniques, Stellander meticulously analyzed over 240 hours of post-disappearance footage, creating detailed behavioral timelines that charted the McCann's emotional and psychological states across various interviews and public appearances. What immediately struck me was the compartmentalization, Stellander noted. In cases of genuine child abduction, parents typically display consistent emotional distress regardless of the question being asked. The McCanns, particularly Gerry, exhibited what we call contextual emotional switching, the ability to transition from apparent distress to composed rationality within seconds when questioning shifted from Madeleine to the investigation itself. Stellander's initial observations revealed several patterns that contradicted typical parental behavior in child abduction cases. First was what he termed anticipatory answering, responding to implications rather than actual questions, suggesting preparation for expected challenges. Second was pronoun distancing, the unconscious linguistic separation from events or individuals through pronoun choice. Third was narrative rigidity, an unusual adherence to specific phrasings when describing key events, even across multiple interviews. When someone experiences a traumatic event, their recounting of it evolves naturally over time as their brain processes the experience, Stellander explained. The McCann's descriptions of critical moments remained almost verbatim across interviews spanning months, a phenomenon I've only observed in cases where subjects have rehearsed statements rather than recalled genuine memories. The red flags that ultimately convinced Stellander to launch a full investigation accumulated during his analysis of the first press conference the McCanns gave after Madeleine's disappearance. Using high-definition footage, he identified 7 distinct deception indicators within a 5-minute segment. incongruent emotional displays, tears without corresponding facial muscle activation, self-comfort gestures coinciding with specific claims rather than emotional moments, micro-expressions of what appeared to be contempt when discussing Portuguese police efforts, pupil constriction rather than dilation when describing Madeleine's abduction, synchronized blinking patterns between the couple when addressing timeline questions, neck touching, a stress indicator, specifically when mentioning the frequency of room checks, voice pitch modulation, inconsistent with genuine emotional distress. Any one of these indicators in isolation would be insignificant, Stellander noted, but clustering of multiple deception markers during specific narrative points creates what we call hotspots, moments that warrant deeper investigation. Perhaps most troubling to Stellander was what he didn't observe, certain behaviors typically present in parents of abducted children. The McCanns showed a notable absence of what psychologists call parental hypervigilance, the constant scanning of environments and strangers that typically persists for months after a child's disappearance. They also demonstrated what Stellander termed premature acceptance language, subtle verbal cues suggesting psychological preparation for permanent loss rather than the resolute belief in recovery that characterizes most parents of missing children. In over 2 decades analyzing parental behavior in child disappearance cases, I've never seen this particular constellation of indicators, Stellander wrote. The behavioral evidence suggested a narrative being managed rather than a trauma being processed. What time is it where you're watching from? Stellander spent countless nights just like this one monitoring behavior patterns. As his analysis deepened, Stellander began correlating behavioral indicators with specific case elements, creating what he called trigger maps, charts showing which topics consistently produced stress responses in the McCanns. 3 topics emerged as particularly significant: the timeline between 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. on May 3rd, the positioning of furniture in the apartment, and, most notably, questions about locations in the hills overlooking Praia da Luz. This last trigger point became increasingly significant when Stellander discovered, through careful review of background footage, that Gerry McCann had made an undisclosed visit to the hills during the week following Madeleine's disappearance. This visit, never mentioned in police statements or media interviews, occurred during a 90-minute window when Gerry claimed to be making phone calls to family members, calls that Stellander later confirmed never connected. The hill location became my focus for 2 reasons, Stellander explained. First, it consistently triggered stress indicators when even peripherally mentioned. Second, it represented the only documented instance of deliberate misdirection about whereabouts that I could verify through visual evidence. By the 3rd month of his investigation, Stellander had compiled enough behavioral evidence to justify more direct investigative techniques. He traveled to Praia da Luz, where he would spend the next 4 months conducting environmental analysis, interviewing peripheral witnesses, never formally questioned by police, and, most critically, establishing surveillance of the hill location that had emerged as a behavioral hotspot. What he discovered there would transform his investigation from behavioral analysis to something far more disturbing. This investigation gets deeper by the minute. Like this video if you want part 2 where we examine the forensic evidence. Stellander's discovery of Gerry McCann's secretive hill visit came through methodical cross-referencing of background footage from news crews that had descended on Praia da Luz. While reviewing B-roll footage from a Spanish news team, Stellander noticed Gerry's distinctive figure walking purposefully away from town at 6:43 a.m. on May 7, 2007, 4 days after Madeleine's disappearance. The footage, lasting only 7 seconds, showed McCann heading toward a dirt path leading to the hills northwest of the resort. What made this significant wasn't just the undisclosed journey, Stellander noted, but the timing and his demeanor. This wasn't a distraught father searching randomly. His movement was directed, purposeful, a man with a specific destination. Stellander reconstructed a detailed timeline of that morning through witness statements and time-stamped media footage. 5:15 a.m., Kate McCann seen on hotel balcony, visibly distressed. 5:30 a.m., Gerry McCann speaks briefly with Portuguese detective João Carlos. 5:45 a.m. McCann returns to apartment, declines breakfast brought by resort staff 6:17 a.m., phone call received from British consulate, lasted 4 minutes, 6:22 a.m., McCann leaves apartment alone, tells a reporter he needs air. 6:43 a.m., captured on Spanish news footage heading toward hills 8:17 a.m., returns to apartment, now wearing different shoes 8:25 a.m., joins Kate for scheduled police interview, reports having walked the beach. The 94-minute window of Gerry's absence became Stellander's investigative focus. The hill area, approximately 1.7 kilometers from the Ocean Club resort, offered a panoramic view of Praia da Luz and the surrounding countryside. More importantly, it contained several abandoned wells and construction sites that had been only cursorily examined by Portuguese authorities. The location itself raised immediate questions, Stellander wrote. Why would someone whose child had allegedly been abducted from a resort area choose to walk alone to a remote hillside rather than areas where an abductor might have traveled? And why misrepresent this journey as walking the beach, a location in the opposite direction? To understand the significance of the hill location, Stellander employed surveillance techniques refined during his military career. He established 3 observation posts overlooking the area, equipped with high-resolution cameras and motion-activated recording devices. For 6 weeks, he documented every visitor to the area, creating a pattern-of-life baseline for the location. The surveillance revealed something unexpected. Gerry McCann wasn't the only person connected to the case who had visited the hill. On 3 separate occasions in the 2 weeks following Madeleine's disappearance, an unidentified man visited the same general area. Through telephoto documentation and subsequent analysis, Stellander identified this individual as one of the resort maintenance workers who had been briefly interviewed by police but never considered a person of interest. The convergence was too significant to be coincidental, Stellander noted. 2 individuals connected to the case, visiting the same remote location, neither acknowledging these visits to authorities. Stellander's breakthrough came when he employed ground-penetrating radar to examine disturbed soil areas his surveillance had identified. Near an abandoned well approximately 400 meters from the main path, he discovered evidence of recent digging, an area approximately 1 meter by 2 meters, where the soil composition differed from surrounding terrain. The soil had been disturbed and replaced, he documented. More tellingly, it contained traces of bleach, a cleaning agent not naturally occurring in soil samples and commonly used to destroy DNA evidence. Stellander's psychological analysis of Gerry's behavior during and after the hill visit revealed what he termed post-action resolution indicators, subtle behavioral changes suggesting the completion of a stressful task. In media appearances before the May 7th hill visit, Gerry exhibited classic signs of acute anxiety, rapid blinking, dry mouth, evidenced by frequent swallowing, and what behavioral analysts call gestural leakage, unconscious hand movements indicating internal distress. In appearances after the hill visit, these indicators diminished significantly. Stellander documented a 64% reduction in stress-related behaviors and the emergence of what he called narrative confidence, a more assured delivery of the abduction account with fewer self-corrections and hesitations. This behavioral shift is consistent with what we observe when individuals resolve an outstanding stressor, Stellander explained. In missing persons cases where family members are involved, we often see this transition after they've addressed evidence concerns, typically through better concealment or destruction of remaining evidence. The significance of the hill location extended beyond Gerry's secretive visit. Stellander's topographical analysis revealed that the site offered line of sight to apartment 5A, the tapas restaurant, and the beach, essentially providing visual coverage of all key locations in the official timeline. More importantly, it represented the most direct route from the apartment to areas outside the search perimeter, established by Portuguese police in the initial hours after Madeleine was reported missing. The hill wasn't just a random location, Stellander concluded. It represented a strategic vantage point and potential corridor of movement that had been overlooked in the official investigation. The pattern of Stellander's investigation shifted dramatically when he made an unexpected discovery that changed his entire approach. While examining satellite imagery of the area from May 4th, the day after Madeleine's disappearance, he identified what appeared to be a fresh vehicle track leading from a service road near the Ocean Club to within 100 meters of the disturbed soil site on the hill. This vehicle track didn't appear on imagery from May 2nd and had been partially obscured by rainfall on May 8th imagery. More significantly, the track width matched the wheelbase of the Renault Scenic that the McCanns had rented 25 days after Madeleine's disappearance, the same vehicle in which cadaver dogs later alerted to the scent of human remains. The vehicle track was the missing link, Stellander wrote. It suggested a level of premeditation and planning that contradicted the chaotic abduction narrative. More importantly, it indicated that someone with local knowledge had identified this location in advance as suitable for their purposes. This discovery transformed Stellander's investigation from retrospective analysis to active pursuit of forensic evidence. If someone had accessed the hill location by vehicle in the hours after Madeleine's disappearance, physical evidence might still exist despite the passage of time. Stellander shifted his focus to establishing a forensic timeline that could explain how Gerry McCann, or someone acting on his behalf, could have transported Madeleine to the hill location without being detected by the search efforts that began shortly after her reported disappearance. What he uncovered next would reveal a disturbing sequence of events that directly contradicted the official timeline of that fateful night. The official abduction theory hinged on a critical 30-minute window between 9:05 p.m., when Gerry McCann checked on his children, and 9:35 p.m., when Matthew Oldfield allegedly looked into the McCann children's bedroom but didn't confirm Madeleine's presence. According to this timeline, an unknown intruder entered apartment 5A through a window, took Madeleine, and vanished without leaving identifiable forensic evidence or being spotted by any of the dozens of people in the vicinity. Stellander's investigation systematically dismantled this narrative through multiple lines of evidence. First, he conducted a physical reconstruction of the alleged entry point, a window in the children's bedroom. Using the same model of window installed in apartment 5A, Stellander demonstrated that opening it from the outside created a distinctive metallic sound measuring 72 decibels, easily audible to anyone inside the room and likely to wake sleeping children. The window entry theory fails basic acoustic testing, Stellander documented. More critically, the window dimensions and position would require an intruder to climb through head first, then navigate a narrow space between the bed and wall without disturbing two sleeping children or leaving trace evidence. Stellander's forensic timing analysis revealed further inconsistencies. By mapping witness movements and time-stamped communications, he identified what he called a critical gap in the timeline, a 47-minute period where Gerry McCann's whereabouts couldn't be independently verified by anyone outside the Tapas 7. This gap occurred between 8:30 p.m. when he left the dinner table and 9:17 p.m. when waiter Jose Baptista recorded serving him a main course. The official timeline states Gerry returned to the table after checking the children at approximately 9:10 p.m., Stellander noted. However, 3 independent witnesses place him in conversation with Jez Wilkins near the apartment at 9:15 p.m., and restaurant records show his food being served at 9:17 p.m. This creates an impossible sequence unless the 9:05 p.m. check never occurred as described. More damning was Stellander's analysis of cell tower data he obtained through contacts in Portuguese telecommunications. Gerry's phone connected to a cell tower covering the hill area at 9:27 p.m. for approximately 3 minutes, a time when, according to the official timeline, he was sitting at the restaurant table. This cell tower connection couldn't have occurred if the phone was at the Tapas restaurant, as the restaurant was served by a different tower with no overlap in coverage. The cell data directly contradicts sworn statements, Stellander wrote. It places Gerry's phone, if not Gerry himself, in the vicinity of the hill during the critical window when Madeleine allegedly disappeared. Perhaps most compelling was Stellander's reconstruction of events based on overlooked witness statements. Jane Tanner, one of the Tapas 7, reported seeing a man carrying a child near the McCann apartment around 9:15 p.m., a sighting that became central to the abduction theory. However, Stellander uncovered statements from 4 independent witnesses who were in that exact location at that precise time and saw no such person. The Tanner sighting has 3 possibilities, Stellander concluded. It was fabricated to support the abduction narrative. It occurred at a different time than reported, or it was actually Gerry McCann himself being observed returning to the apartment, a possibility supported by the clothing description matching what McCann was wearing that evening. Beyond physical evidence, Stellander's behavioral analysis identified key indicators that contradicted expected responses to child abduction. He documented these in what he called his Behavioral Inconsistency Index. The McCann's decision to leave their other children in the same apartment the night after Madeleine allegedly was abducted from it. Behavior inconsistent with the hyperprotective response typical of parents who believe an abductor targeted their family. Gerry's focus on establishing a precise timeline within hours of the disappearance. Behavior more consistent with establishing an alibi than locating a missing child. The immediate introduction of a prepared narrative about a gemmied window and raised shutters, claims later proven forensically impossible as the shutters could only be raised from inside. The unprecedented media campaign launched within days, including prepared talking points, branded materials, and strategic messaging typically seen weeks into missing persons cases, not hours. The McCann's refusal to participate in a reconstruction of the night's events, standard procedure in missing persons cases, and typically embraced by parents desperate to generate new leads. When analyzed collectively, these behavioral anomalies suggest foreknowledge rather than reaction, Stellander wrote. The response patterns align more closely with crisis management than with the chaotic, emotionally driven behavior of parents experiencing unexpected trauma. Stellander's most controversial finding came through cadaver dog evidence. While Portuguese authorities had employed cadaver dogs that alerted to the scent of human remains in the McCann's rental car and apartment, these findings were dismissed due to questions about reliability. Stellander, however, brought in Martin Grime, a world-renowned dog handler whose evidence had been used in over 200 criminal cases, to independently assess the hill location. Grime's specialized cadaver dog, Eddie, alerted strongly to the disturbed soil area Stellander had identified through ground-penetrating radar. More significantly, the dog also alerted to a specific section of the service road leading to the hill, the same section where satellite imagery had shown vehicle tracks appearing on May 4th. The dog evidence, while not conclusive alone, creates a forensic bridge between the apartment, the hill location, and the later rental car, Stellander documented. The consistent alerts suggest the transfer of human remains along this specific route. This case has haunted investigators for years. Share this video to help bring awareness to Stellander's findings. Stellander's comprehensive challenge to the official narrative culminated in what he called his alternative timeline, a forensically supported reconstruction of what he believed actually occurred on May 3, 2007, and the days that followed. This timeline placed Madeleine's death earlier in the evening, before the alarm was raised, with subsequent actions representing an elaborate effort to conceal this fact rather than respond to an abduction. What's the most surprising aspect of this case to you? Let me know in the comments below. Stellander's findings created immediate polarization among forensic experts when he first presented them at a closed-door symposium on cold case methodology in Geneva in 2014. Criminal profiler Dr. Elise Montfort called his work a masterclass in behavioral forensics, while former Scotland Yard detective Ian Bradshaw dismissed it as speculative overreach based on subjective interpretation of normal grief responses. This division reflected the broader reaction his investigation would receive. Forensic psychologist Dr. Miriam Heller, who specializes in parental behavior in child disappearance cases, found Stellander's behavioral analysis compelling. His methodology is sound. The clustering of deception indicators he identified goes well beyond what we would expect from parents experiencing media pressure. The behavioral patterns he documented are consistent with what we observe in cases of concealment rather than genuine searching. Conversely, criminal defense attorney James Whitfield criticized Stellander's approach. He begins with suspicion and works backward, interpreting every action through that lens. This reverses the presumption of innocence that underpins our justice system. When Stellander attempted to present his findings to Operation Grange, the Metropolitan Police review of the McCann case, he encountered institutional resistance. His 380-page report was acknowledged, but never formally addressed. A Freedom of Information request later revealed internal communications dismissing his work as potentially libelous and outside investigative parameters, without specific refutation of his evidence. The reluctance to engage with contradictory evidence is telling, Stellander noted. In my military career, alternative analysis was actively encouraged to prevent tunnel vision. In the McCann case, alternative theories are treated as threats rather than potential paths to resolution. Media reception proved equally challenging. Mainstream British publications universally declined to cover Stellander's investigation, citing legal concerns. Several journalists privately expressed interest, but reported editorial blockades. One senior reporter at a major UK newspaper told Stellander, "This is the third rail of British journalism. The libel laws make it impossible to report your findings, regardless of their merit." Continental European media proved somewhat more receptive. Germany's Der Spiegel published a feature examining Stellander's methodology without endorsing his conclusions. Portuguese newspaper Correio da Manhã ran a 3-part series on his Hill discovery, though it carefully framed his work as an alternative perspective rather than factual reporting. The impact on the ongoing search for Madeleine was perhaps Stellander's greatest frustration. Despite identifying specific locations for forensic examination, particularly the Hill site, no official investigation ever followed up on his findings. The McCann's private investigators similarly ignored his reports, continuing to pursue abduction leads exclusively. Resources that could be directed toward evidence-based investigation continue to be squandered on implausible sightings and false leads, Stellander wrote in 2015. The tragedy extends beyond Madeleine to the misallocation of resources that might resolve her case. Public perception of Stellander's work reflected the broader polarization surrounding the McCann case. Online communities dedicated to examining the disappearance embraced his findings, sometimes overstating their conclusiveness. Conversely, supporters of the McCanns dismissed him as a conspiracy theorist without engaging with his evidence. This division often obscured the methodological rigor of his actual investigation. The controversy surrounding his work intensified when Stellander published behavioral forensics case studies in Deception Analysis in 2016, a textbook that included anonymized elements of the McCann case as teaching examples. Though legally careful to present his analysis as methodology rather than accusations, the book triggered cease and desist letters from the McCann's legal team, ultimately forcing the publisher to withdraw it from circulation. Stellander faced numerous obstacles in sharing his theory beyond legal threats. Professional ostracism followed his public association with the case, with speaking engagements cancelled and consulting contracts terminated. Former colleagues distanced themselves, concerned about reputational damage. His home was vandalized twice and he received numerous threats that police classified as credible but never resolved. The intensity of resistance to evidence-based questioning in this case is unprecedented in my experience, Stellander noted. It suggests forces beyond normal legal caution at work, powerful interests invested in maintaining the abduction narrative regardless of contradictory evidence. The psychological toll of the 7-year investigation manifested in Stellander's deteriorating health. Diagnosed with stress-induced hypertension in 2012, he later developed insomnia and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. His marriage ended in 2014, with his ex-wife citing his obsession with the case as the primary factor. By 2016, he had liquidated his retirement savings to fund the investigation and was living in a small apartment in Geneva, surrounded by case files. I understand now why whistleblowers often regret their decisions despite believing in their necessity, Stellander wrote in his final case notes. The system doesn't merely disagree with contradictory voices, it actively works to silence them. Despite these personal costs, Stellander maintained that his investigations served a necessary function, challenging a narrative accepted more through repetition than evidence. His work represented what he called the obligation of doubt, the professional responsibility to question established conclusions when evidence warrants, regardless of popular opinion or institutional pressure. This case isn't about proving a specific theory, he concluded. It's about acknowledging that the official narrative fails basic forensic scrutiny. Until we accept that fundamental reality, justice for Madeleine remains impossible. Today, Bernt Stellander's investigation exists in a state of suspended animation. In 2018, following a series of legal challenges and health concerns, Stellander placed his complete case files, including soil samples, photographic evidence and behavioral analysis data, into secure storage with instructions that they remain sealed until either the McCann case is officially resolved or 2027, whichever comes first. Now living in relative seclusion in his native Sweden, Stellander no longer gives interviews or comments publicly on the case. His last known statement came through a brief written response to a documentary filmmaker in 2019. The evidence speaks for itself. I have nothing more to add that would serve justice rather than sensation. Despite Stellander's withdrawal from public discourse, his methodologies have quietly influenced a new generation of investigators. His behavioral forensics protocols have been adopted by several European police academies, though typically without attribution to their controversial originator. His emphasis on behavioral inconsistency as an investigative starting point has particularly gained traction in cold case reviews. Numerous unanswered questions remain, haunting both the official investigation and Stellander's alternative theory. The hill location he identified has never been properly excavated or forensically examined by authorities, despite his compelling evidence. The maintenance worker who visited the same area remains unidentified in public records. The cell tower data showing Gerry McCann's phone connecting near the hill has never been officially acknowledged or explained. Perhaps most significantly, no investigation has ever reconciled the cadaver dog alerts in multiple locations with the official abduction narrative. As Stellander noted in his final case summary, the central question isn't whether evidence of death exists, it's why this evidence has been systematically ignored in favor of increasingly implausible abduction scenarios. The lasting impact of Stellander's work extends beyond the McCann case itself. His investigation represents a watershed moment in the application of behavioral analysis to high-profile cases where physical evidence is limited or compromised. By demonstrating how behavioral forensics can identify investigative blind spots, Stellander established a methodology that has since been applied to numerous cold cases across Europe. More broadly, his work forced the uncomfortable conversation about how media narratives, public sympathy, and institutional inertia can create investigative immunity, situations where certain theories become effectively untouchable regardless of contradictory evidence. As one criminologist noted, Stellander's legacy isn't his conclusion about the McCanns, but his demonstration that no case should be beyond methodical questioning. For Madeleine McCann, the ultimate impact of Stellander's investigation remains unrealized. Until authorities are willing to examine all evidence, including that which contradicts the established narrative, her fate remains officially unresolved. Stellander's work stands as both a roadmap to potential answers and a testament to the institutional resistance that has prevented their pursuit. This is just one of many untold stories of dedicated investigators challenging official narratives. Subscribe to Criminal Instinct for more cases that will change how you see justice. As Stellander himself wrote in the final line of his case files, "Truth doesn't require belief to exist. It waits patiently in the evidence, regardless of whether we have the courage to acknowledge it." What's the weather like where you are? While you're watching this in comfort, remember investigators like Stellander work in all conditions to uncover the truth. The hill outside Praia da Luz remains unchanged, a silent witness to whatever truly happened to Madeleine McCann. And somewhere in Sweden, a former military detective carries the burden of an investigation that revealed more than perhaps anyone was prepared to accept.